Good afternoon and welcome to this conversation among colleagues and friends. And we are now going to be discussing about biodiversity finance future, present, and a bit about the past. This is Martin Cadena, and I'm the Global Programme Manager for UNDP Biodiversity Finance Initiative, also known as BIOFIN. And today, I'm with Mariana Bellot, who is our BIOFIN Regional Technical Advisor for Latin America and the Caribbean. For how long, Mariana?
8 years now.
8 years, wow. And we're also here with Onno van den Heuvel, who is our Global Lead on Biodiversity Finance and the former BIOFIN Global Program Manager. For how long, Onno?
I've done over 10 years now in work. Yeah.
So with this richness, this collective experience of almost 2 decades, I would love us to start talking about the biodiversity finance future. And I think we agree that 2024 and the beginning of 2025 has been a turbulent time worldwide. So many things happening, from unprecedented shift in ODA and capital flows, and people may have missed some important milestones on biodiversity and biodiversity finance. And I know, Onno, you recently participated in the UN Biodiversity Conference, also known as the Conference of the Parties, or COP, in this case COP16, and biodiversity finance was at the front and at the center of the discussions. So what were the decisions and how these decisions will impact countries regarding biodiversity finance?
Yes, thank you. Turbulent times indeed, and therefore it's a good moment to look at what's happening in finance for nature. And the most important decision in that respect was actually the adoption of the Resource Mobilization Strategy of the Biodiversity Convention, which had been kind of overdue for a while and has finally been agreed to. So I think, first of all, to see that agreement among countries was in itself a very important milestone, to see that in the present day. But to look more closely what's in that document, actually there are a number of things. I think it sort of, first of all, echoes that for biodiversity, we have to look at all possible sources of finance. So this means like public, private, international, national, traditional, innovative. It matters much more where the money is going to biodiversity rather than where it's coming from. So that's the vision of this document. And within that vision, every country is doing their own thing. They're going to develop what we call National Biodiversity Finance Plans. So it's their own domestic plan created by national stakeholders to decide what are the top priorities in terms of financing for their country. And that's exactly what BIOFIN does as a program, to help countries to design those and to implement those. A very important section of this resource mobilization strategy is actually to call for countries to provide more funding for developing countries to develop and implement their biodiversity finance plans. So it's been really recognized that countries deserve the funding to implement all of the solutions that they've included in those biodiversity finance plans. And we have then now like a network of 133 countries that are working on these plans. Some are just starting and others are quite ahead and have a lot of results to show. Well, one thing is really clear is that across the board, we definitely need to scale up this work much more.
And about, the size of the challenge ahead, we know is gigantic. We're talking about $700 billion per year to fill the biodiversity finance gap, plus other $700 billion that are invested in, what we can define as harmful nature. Mariana, you have been with the Convention on Biological Diversity negotiations for a long time. How countries are shifting their perspective in biodiversity finance to close these gaps?
Indeed, I have been following CBD negotiations on finance for many years, and I think what Onno mentioned now is it's been a challenge, but also very interesting to see how the conversation has evolved from years ago when countries talked about how to close the finance gap, where most of the conversation was about how to increase international funding to close this gap. It's still very relevant. International funding is a catalyzer for mobilizing funds at the national level. But I think in the past 10 years, and BIOFIN has played a big role there, we've realized as a community that mobilizing funding at the national level is the most substantive and long-term best strategy that a country can have. And BIOFIN's work is actually focuses on supporting countries in understanding what is the finance landscape for biodiversity in the countries and how can we be creative and understand the amazing opportunities and landscape a country can develop through finance solutions. Finance solution is what we call in BIOFIN. There are different options. We have developed a catalog of 150 finance solutions where countries can choose when they are at the stage of developing a BFP, a Biodiversity Finance Plan. And we found so many new sources of funding that the biodiversity community perhaps didn't realize that were there, and we're unlocking opportunities at the national level.
I would like to, highlight the BIOFIN catalog of finance solutions. I think that is an essential and vital tool that transforms this implicit knowledge into explicit, so countries and new countries can dive into this broad spectrum of solutions, from the more traditional, that could be, green bonds and trust funds, to the more innovative, that can be Islamic finance, why not, and financial tech. And it complements really well what BIOFIN has on the workbook. That is, part of the methodology itself, and it's when the methodology comes alive on the solutions catalog.
Martin, it's great that you mentioned a bit about our methodology and guidance that we're giving to countries, because we have that guidebook called the BIOFIN Workbook that has been very central to the work that we're doing. And I still remember at the very beginning that we had to kind of think about, okay, what should be actually in this methodology? What is a methodology to develop a national biodiversity finance plan? There was nothing really out there, so we just started to put our ideas in that and came with the first version. And then countries started to use that, and we learned from them. We added more into the next version, and so on. And we have done this now 4 times. So we have come to the 2024 BIOFIN Workbook, and it has lots of, let's say, DNA material from all the countries that have been using it over the years. So it's now very rich in experience. But the main process, actually, interestingly, is still relatively similar to the beginning. To first do some kind of like diagnostic scan of a country. So what are the subsidies that you have? What are the financing mechanisms? What are you spending on biodiversity? That's literally $1 million question. That's pretty hard. So we're looking beyond just like national parks to the whole. It's a scan of your whole economy. Which sectors, and to which extent, are they actually really nature positive? And then you calculate your finance gap, and then you come with that famous Biodiversity Finance Plan. And if you look at it, if you don't know this product, you probably think, wow, this is like very technical stuff. There's a bunch of professors using this and writing this. This is not me. But actually, the most important part is not this technical part. The most important part is really the process at the national level. And we really have banked on working mainly with national teams and a national coalition of stakeholders in every country. This is somehow like a sacred principle. And we like to say, we don't want to hire experts, but we want to help to create a new generation of biodiversity finance experts in every country that we work in. And this is perhaps even the most important output of this whole work. And also, I think it's really about looking at the institutional framework of a country. And again, this process part is really important there. So we want to kind of do 2 things. We want to work with, of course, still the environment community, the biodiversity community, and ministries of environment. And we want to build their understanding and awareness of finance. We want them to become a finance expert. And at the same time, we start also working with the finance ministry. And we want to help them to understand what is biodiversity all about. Why should you invest in it? Why should you allocate budgets to that? And what are the benefits, not just for nature and all the beautiful animals that we all like, but for the economy? And I think we've seen an increasing recognition, actually, that nature is really fundamental for our economies, and we're trying to play a part in that development. And so, but then fast forward, obviously, in terms of the technical documents, the most important output is that Biodiversity Finance Plan. And again, that looks like very technical, but I can tell everybody that we made it very practical. We made it very much applied. This is a very practical document, more like an action plan for your country, with, let's say, the top 10 finance solutions that can help to close the finance gap if you implement all of them. Countries are right now implementing maybe 2, 3, or 4, or 5, or they're just starting. Almost no country has actually implemented all of their finance solutions. And these finance solutions, they're inspired by the catalog or by any idea that comes from the country. But again, going back to the process, it's the national stakeholders, they're coming together. They're checking the whole catalog. They're checking any idea that's out there. They're discussing, and they're kind of long listing and short listing, and then they come with their plan. But while doing that, they're also actually doing something or going to do something, and it's something we added in the latest version of this workbook, kind of visioning exercise. So they're first starting to think, okay, what are the really priorities here? Is it tourism? Is it agriculture? Is it maybe the extractive industries? Where do we want to, come up with a set of like priority solutions? And so what's our vision for the priorities of this plan? Maybe climate change, of course, is increasingly very important. And then also a really important part that we have been adding is actually a dedicated implementation stage. Just think about it. There's so many plans out there. Just how many of those plans that you know have like a dedicated implementation stage? So this is something that is like relatively simple, but we don't see it very much. But we have this dedicated implementation. That's pretty much become the main thing that we're actually doing right now. And we even go beyond that by adding a stage of what we call early implementation. And what that means is that when you start the exercise of examining the finance landscape, you already find opportunities. Every country has so many opportunities. There are always opportunities in countries. There's always finance. We just have to make it go into the right direction. And so the early implementation means that you don't wait till the full plan is developed, because that's going to take 2 or 3 years. You're going to already from the get-go take 1, 2, or 3 solutions and get into action mode and start to show some very clear results that can then also again inform the Biodiversity Finance Plan.
So you have discussed about capacities, and I just recently joined the BIOFIN program. And it's great for me to see all this infrastructure in place, and that countries are, getting their teams in place, that we are here in Santiago, reunited with 133 countries to exchange and to learn from one another. So there are many pieces of the puzzle that are already there. But since you've been with BIOFIN for long, Mariana and Onno, what do you think could make our BIOFIN program more future ready? Is there anything we can do to make it more future ready?
I think one of the biggest assets of the BIOFIN program, it started as a project and now it's a global program. It's the people that have been following this community and story. Some of them are still with BIOFIN, some of them are now working for banks, for the private sector, but they're still BIOFIN friends and family. And I see that what we have built in every country that we've been working with has now its own community of practitioners. We've brought together different stakeholders that are now trying to partner with, not only with UNDP, but among other agencies to develop different finance solutions to be a central part of the implementation of the finance plans. A colleague of ours from Germany said BIOFIN has become the lighthouse of biodiversity finance. So the process that we build in a country that it takes 2 or 3 years is not just developing the BFP. It's actually a process where we bring in different stakeholders in every country that we've worked with, and we connect them with other countries within the same region or in other regions to learn from what they've done, what has worked and what hasn't worked. And on a personal experience, I first joined BIOFIN as a national coordinator for Mexico. And I remember I joined one of the first regional workshops, and there were other countries in Latin America who had already started implementing the BIOFIN methodology. And I remember very clearly, many of them told me, do not do this and do it this way. And it saved me so much time, energy, and I learned so much from them. And we've been replicating that system. And now that we're bringing 92 additional countries, I think this conference here is a reflection of that learning process, 10-year process, that all the new countries will benefit now from these exchanges, learning and learning process.
Anything else you might want to add about Future Ready?
Yes, absolutely. I think we have to do, first of all, more of the same. We have to do more and more of different things. So I think more of the same means that most of those finance solutions that are ongoing, they're actually going to need more time. So to get these mechanisms adopted, sometimes can take 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And that's a reality, and you can't rush it because these are things requiring changes in legislation, into fiscal systems, and so on, like introducing, for example, tax breaks or changing subsidies. Is not something you do in a couple of weeks. This is a multi-year thing. So we have to keep going with the solutions that we already have to make sure that they really produce the long-term sustainable results that we're looking at. At the same time, we have to do also more because we need to add more solutions that are implemented. So right now, I think we have around between 150 and 200 solutions that are being implemented. But if you would add up all those finance plans, including the ones that are being made, you would reach maybe 1,000 solutions. So these solutions, the 1,000, they will also need to be funded and they will need to be implemented. And they're going to need also their 4 or 5 years. They're not going to be able to do those things in a few weeks. And why we also need more of different is we also have to keep looking closely at what exactly we're doing and try to add new solutions. So I think when we started, there's always this idea of what are innovative solutions. And this is actually something that's always changing. So what was in the 90s innovative, things like maybe payment for ecosystem services or biodiversity offsets or trust funds, they're not innovative, the most innovative mechanisms anymore. Now, later came, for example, like green bonds. And now we see a whole generation of new solutions. For example, things like fintech application. We have a gaming app, which is called Animal Town, which I recommend everybody to download and play. It's really exciting. If you do an in-app purchase, or if you watch an ad, actually the money is going to a Philippine Forest Foundation. And so you can be a lazy environmentalist. You can sit on your couch, you can play the game and actually make money for nature, do something good. But this is one of the more innovative mechanisms. And we're also looking very carefully with a sister program called the Insurance and Risk Financing Facility at Insurance and Nature. That's another whole new universe where you can look at this intersection. And there are a couple of mechanisms that have already been at the proof of concept stage, for example, human wildlife conflict-related insurance, and also insurance for coral reefs. So there's a lot of these new mechanisms coming up, but they're at a very small scale. But we're also looking at, for example, how insurance companies are investing their money and how those investments can be good for nature or at least not bad for nature. So there's this whole spectrum of things that we are constantly trying to add to give an opportunity at more and more different solutions to look at. So I think we have to work along those 3 axes, but most of all, we have to keep going. We have just extended BIOFIN until 2030, which is fantastic, and thanks to the support by governments that we're getting for this work. But if it was up to me, I would already put the bar at 2040 or 2050, because it doesn't look like the finance gap is going to go away on its own. There will be support needed. Communities, local governments, national governments, they need this kind of support. They deserve the support. They're doing a conservation job on all our behalf. And as we've seen already, this all requires a long time to build capacities and to change laws and to change policies. So we need this very long gestation time for the solution. So I really hope this is a kind of work that we can continue in a long time from now.
And if I add, you mentioned some dimensions, and another way of looking at what we've been doing in BIOFIN is not only trying to increase positive investments for biodiversity, but also decreasing the negative investments, what we also call harmful subsidies. And that has become a huge line of work for BIOFIN in recent years. We launched the guidance for assessing harmful subsidies. We have many countries now working with their ministers of finance or development banks trying to green their credits to avoid negative impacts, or improving, actually investing in with positive impacts. And since COP15, harmful subsidies has become, it has a lot of attention. But it's hard. It's one of the hardest things to work on. And I think with the examples that we're slowly but surely building in different countries around the world, one of them is in this region with Colombia. They're working with Finagro, a development bank, supporting them in greening different value chains. We are proving the concept that we can make a difference, even though it's a high, how do you say, it's not a low-hanging fruit, but the other way around. But we can do it.
So, Onno, talking about implementation, we are already seeing promising results. Can you tell us more about the global results, and then dive a little bit on countries' individual finance results?
Yes, it's a pleasure. I think that in the last 5 years, we have seen what we call finance results. So countries really generating more finance, or maybe realigning finance away from where it was considered harmful. And we have a very sort of rigid system of tracking those results. And so far we have seen already $1.6 billion of results from all those countries combined, which is starting to look like this is going into the right direction. And one of the most successful mechanisms is been actually looking at protected area finance. So we have had, for example, work done in the Philippines, where we work with a parliament member to first of all fill a policy gap that they had. There was lots of protected areas that had been proclaimed, but not officially written into the laws and not formally gazetted, and therefore they received less money. So we helped first of all to rewrite the law. Of course, this was mainly led by the parliament, and that new law was being passed, and then we helped them to develop a new budget proposal, and this has since seen more than $80 million of new allocations for protected areas in the Philippines. So that's a very sizable result. And another result I would like to mention is coming from Zambia, which is more oriented towards the private sector. But that result has one thing in common with the results of the Philippines. It kind of combines like a policy outcome with a finance result. So there we help to develop a national framework for green bonds, and also tax breaks. So for example, if you are issuing a green bond as a private institute, you can benefit from a tax break. And if you buy a green bond, as for example an individual, you can also benefit from a tax break. And this has been very conducive, and 2 years ago the first corporate green bond has been issued. And this has already seen an amount of $150 million in finance being generated through this green bond. So this is a more private sector oriented solution. And one solution that I'm personally very passionate about, I really want to add here, is actually crowdfunding. This became a priority for us when we had the COVID-19 pandemic. Because traditionally crowdfunding is not the kind of solution that brings a lot of money. Most crowdfunding campaigns are actually relatively small. And it's not always clear there's sort of like an emerging need that calls for an urgency to really rally people to contribute to such a campaign. But this all changed when we had the COVID-19 campaign, because around the world, conservation communities from one day to the next had no tourists. And no tourists means no income. So we started a global campaign. It was called Keep Conservation Heroes in Their Job. So an example is coming from the island of Koh Tao in Thailand, where obviously tourists were not coming at this time. And so we worked with, in particular, like guides and boatmen who were normally bringing tourists around, to design a cash for work program. So they were helping actually to clear away waste that was still coming on the shore from around the world. And this was then paid by the crowdfunding campaign. And so all around the world, people contributed to this campaign, and we raised around $100,000 for that campaign. And that actually enabled the people on the island to stay there and have a little bit of income and sort of wait out the pandemic. And altogether, our campaigns have raised more than $2 million. So this is a very different kind of mechanism, and one that was very exciting to work on, because you can even directly contribute by, well, first of all, giving a contribution, but also by sharing it with everybody. And this made it really like a mechanism that's really in the spirit of looking at all possible resources.
I think this is a testament that biodiversity finance plans are alive. And I know, Mariana, that you have many more examples for this. Do you mind sharing some?
Yes, of course. And thinking of what the last example that you gave, Onno, it also talks about scales. We in this community, we like to talk about the huge gap we have, that it's just a number that it's difficult to actually understand how that is at the country level, what that means at the country level. But examples like this and others in the Latin American region where I've been working, we have finance solutions at different scales. One of them is at the municipal level in Guatemala, where we are working with 10 municipalities to support them in aligning their yearly budgets for biodiversity and climate purposes. So we developed it's called expenditure allocation catalog, where we're helping them understand what a biodiversity-related activity would look like and request funding for this. So we've mobilized 1,500,000 since we started a few years ago, but the relevance is not the amount, but actually mobilizing subnational stakeholders like a municipal government, where obviously their budget is much less than a state government or a federal government, but it is important nevertheless to make sure they are on board and understand the role they have to play at that level in their own jurisdiction. We have other two examples that have been give us a lot of hope in terms of three examples in terms of working with development banks. I think that development banks in developing countries play a huge role, and they can have a pivotal role in changing the way things are. So we partner in Ecuador with CONAFIPS. We'll hear a lot about them in this conference. And we've worked with them to align $800 million per year to biodiversity finance activities. So we're making sure they're sort of greening their credits rather than having any negative impact. We are working at the moment with Finagro, as I said, in Colombia, working with 6 value chains, the top value chains in the bank, the only and biggest agricultural bank in the country, again, to make sure that these credits that they're giving are not having a negative impact on biodiversity. And last but not least, in Costa Rica, we also partner with a development bank to support indigenous people's tourist small businesses. So this is, again, it's about scale. It's not a large amount of money, but we are making sure that these different stakeholders, like indigenous peoples and local communities, are part of the finance system, because financial inclusiveness is also part of the things we try to do at the national level. So I really like this example in Costa Rica, where we're not funding these tourist enterprises with international money, we are mobilizing funding through a national development bank for sustainable, in a sustainable way, for long-term, with a long-term vision. We have other examples like in Cuba where we've not only piloted but actually institutionalized the first protected area entry fee charge. So it's, for most countries, it's normal to charge when we visit a protected area, we have to pay for an entry fee. This wasn't happening in Cuba, and now it's been a public policy that they will start in 2 protected areas to charge, and that this revenue will help the protected area management and conservation efforts. And they also recently approved the first payment for environmental services plan based on carbon removals. So this is also an example of finance solution that many countries have around the world, but with the support of BIOFIN and a very committed government, now it's part of their public policy.
I see the elements are there for BIOFIN being future ready, and I would like to take or highlight 2 of them that you already mentioned. That BIOFIN is here for the long run because these transformative changes take time, and the other is the power of this emergent global community of practitioners, experts, stakeholders, partners, and the bright future ahead of having countries at different stages of their journeys where they can learn from one another, peer-to-peer, co-create, also practically on real time to shorten the learning curve and support each other. So the possibilities for that on innovation, on knowing what's working, what's not working, are practically endless.
Yeah, and actually, you mentioned this global community. Well, that's becoming ever more global. Because guess what? So we have, of course, as UNDP, according to our mandate, supported developing countries. But now we see actually a lot of developed countries also looking at this process and this methodology. And we have, for example, countries like Netherlands, Belgium, New Zealand. They've also started their National Biodiversity Finance Plan. Of course, they are told to look into that under the Biodiversity Convention as well. And interestingly, they're tuning in to the countries that we've been supporting since the last 10 plus years to understand better what exactly they've been doing. And what is also quite interesting is that the struggles that they're facing are the same struggles, the same challenges. And so I think we've come to a very interesting moment where our countries are ready to share their knowledge with not only the countries in the program, but to any country or sometimes local government that is working on this biodiversity finance plan. So I think one of the visions that we definitely have to have for the future is to have one global biodiversity finance community that works together through meetings like the one we're having this week at global level, but also through regional ones and national ones, to share this knowledge and inspire each other to see what's really possible, because there's a lot possible. And once countries learn from each other, they actually become more empowered to undertake the same solutions in their country.
So we've been discussing about the biodiversity finance future and BIOFIN's role in it. But we did not get here by chance or by pure magic. Behind this, there is years and years of hard work. And BIOFIN has been going on for 10 years now. So for the benefit of new countries, can we do a quick road back to memory lane and talk about the early days, Mariana and Onno, of BIOFIN? How did we get here?
Yeah, I think maybe I can start since I joined BIOFIN when BIOFIN started back in 2013. And I think in that time, if you want to describe what BIOFIN was, it was an idea. It was an idea to develop these national biodiversity finance plans with a couple of steps, like this expenditure review was already there, but nobody had actually done it. And so I started, and there was in that time 12 countries. And those 12 countries, they had to basically be the guinea pig. So they had to try the idea and make it into reality. And so they've been pioneering, and they had actually a very hard time to go through all these very technical steps that we put for them. What they actually found, after you've done it, after you've done your homework, there's also a great reward. Because I want, for example, take this expenditure review. It doesn't sound like very exciting stuff. It's like very difficult screening all budgets and expenditures in a country. But once you've done it, you have established how much every budget item is actually nature positive. You can actually take that to the next level. And so we have seen actually countries that have taken that data and institutionalized it into their budget and expenditure monitoring system. So now it's sort of, I'm a little bit exaggerating, but with one push of the button, they can now repeat this expenditure review. So that's, I think, the most important part of this journey is that we have gone to a very robust concept of how you can develop those finance plans. And then, after the first few years, we created this global and regional community of practice. And then I think the most important sort of decision that was made early on was to look into implementation in particular. So even in the early days when we had those 12 countries, there was just a little bit of money to try some implementation. And so, for example, we're here in Chile. So Chile chose, for example, to work on biodiversity offsets. So they already had this mechanism, but they said, okay, we're looking into it. It needs to be updated. So they helped to develop more detailed guidance, because how you define these biodiversity laws and how you remedy it through an offset, it's kind of hardcore stuff. So they worked on that, and actually a few years later, actually they adopted this guideline. So from the very beginning, this implementation has been important feature. But now I would say this has become the main course of our work, and soon even the countries that are doing the finance plan now, they're moving also in this same direction of implementation. And if you go to one of the workshops that we are in now, most of the program is dedicated to all those different financing mechanisms that you can use for biodiversity. And there's still a part on the design stage, but it's not the biggest part.
I would add that what we've seen in the past 10 years within BIOFIN's own story, but also what's happening in the world, has, let's say, the enabling conditions that countries have now compared to what some countries, the early comers, had 10 years ago is completely different. When the first countries started working with the BIOFIN methodology, every time they would talk to somebody outside the biodiversity community, nobody would understand what we were talking about. We would never expect a central bank talking about biodiversity or any private bank. It was the job of the national coordinator, and it still is, to be the translator between the bio world and the finance world, the BIOFIN, bringing them together. 10 years later, we have TNFD. We have the banking, the finance sector talking about risks related to a loss of nature. We have so many different stakeholders now talking about nature finance that we didn't have 10 years ago. So I think those countries that are joining now are in much better position to develop a good BFP that can be implemented with different sources of funding, both domestic and international, and many more stakeholders around them to support countries in the implementation of their finance plans.
So I'm leaving this conversation super optimistic. I know the challenge is huge, but the pieces, the capacity, the community are there, and I think it's up to the challenge. So I say for 10 or more years of advancing on biodiversity finance, and I really am leaving this conversation with looking at the bright future ahead, and that we can make it possible, and we can clearly close this gigantic finance gap in biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.